Welcome back to Content Cathedral. I'm your host, C. Alex Smith, and you can reach me at authorcalexsmith@gmail.com. This episode is Putting It All Together Part 2, the final episode in the Story Developer series. The last episode we examined how major plot points affect various story arcs up to the midpoint. In this episode, we'll continue our survey of the plot points to the end of the novel, take a cursory look at what Stuart Horowitz calls series, and do a writing exercise that will give you a good rough outline of your project so you can start writing. If you've enjoyed this series and want to become a member of Content Cathedral, drop me a line at my email. You'll meet other writers, get access to the blog, and notification when we produce more educational videos. When we left off, our main character was considering what kind of person they were becoming, and so was the reader. This is frequently a quiet, thoughtful moment in the book. Best not to let the main character ruminate on this subject too long, though, or the tension will drag. Did I say tension? Nothing increases the tension like a goose from the antagonist. Yep, it's time for our antagonist to show up again. The first half of the book, the main character and his friends have grown. They are acting more like a team, and they have stepped up their game. They can handle more opposition. The antagonist, meanwhile, has also become more powerful and more skilled. The fact that both sides have grown ramps up the pressure, so the main character must make more difficult choices. The antagonist is ready to deliver a knockout punch. In fact, sometimes the mentor the main character has relied upon dies at this critical moment. This blow breaks the protagonist's will, leaving the main character hopeless and forlorn. Thus, this scene is also called the lull, or all hope is lost moment, when the protagonist temporarily gives up. The protagonist lulls himself into a false sense of security. Living as a fugitive under the antagonist's radar isn't really so bad after all. But some disaster forces the main character back into the game. An alternative version of this plot point is the premature celebration of success. But the protagonist, with newly acquired wisdom, warns there is more hardship to come, and is not willing to partake in that celebration. For the character, this attack has irrevocably stripped away the old world. Your main character realizes, sometimes for the first time, there is no turning back the clock to regain what once was. Life will simply never be the same. The main character goes into full mourning for what has been lost. Failure, self-doubt, paralysis, brokenness, fatigue, fear, bleakness, emptiness, alienation, suffering, loss, and general despair mark this segment of the story, and this should be a very emotional scene. Sometimes this pining away for the old world makes the character realize she will soon have to give up her flaw and change. Letting go is painful, but necessary to stimulate the new perspective and new behavior seen in the next plot point. Throughout the story, the antagonist and main character have metaphorically argued about some value universally held by mankind. Now that thematic pros and cons debate comes to a head and the reader feels the tension in his heart. The last time we saw Darth Vader, he was torturing Princess Leia and blowing up a whole planet. So how does he raise the stakes for a second point? By making his attack more personal. Obi-Wan has just disabled the Death Star so his friends can escape when he runs into Darth Vader on his way back to the Millennium Falcon. They cross swords, lightsabers, but when Obi-Wan sees that Luke is safe aboard the Millennium Falcon, Obi-Wan makes a very conscious choice to let Vader defeat him. He withdraws his saber and closes his eyes, so Luke apparently does lose his mentor during this scene right on cue. However, Luke hears Obi-Wan's voice in his ear telling him to run. So Obi-Wan has converted to a spirit, and this story of change is not just about Luke becoming a Jedi, but also about Obi-Wan progressing to the next phase of his evolution as well. The All Hope is Lost, lull, or second pinch point, has set the stage for the Act 2 climax, or second plot point. This is also called the crisis, the dark night of the soul, or the black moment. It occurs right before Act 3 and the story climax. At this point, the consequences of all the protagonist's actions seem overwhelming, and the villain, or antagonist, appears to have the upper hand. The lull's disaster forces the main character's team to commit to one course of action in a last-ditch attempt to solve their situation. This is the low point of the narrative arc, and it leads directly to the climax and resolution of the conflict. From here, the action accelerates again. The fuse is lit, building tension for the final explosion in the climax. In the crisis point, the antagonist jeopardizes something personal and vital to the protagonist, usually a relationship. This forces the main character back into the conflict. Things absolutely cannot go on the way they have been in the past. This scene reaches a point of no return, in which direct conflict between the main character and the antagonist becomes inevitable. The circumstances force the main character to make a heroic decision, to act even to the point of martyrdom. The crisis point is all about selfishness versus altruism. The main character is presented with a choice, and it is not an easy choice. He must choose between two bad options or two irreconcilable good options. He makes this choice and develops a new plan with a noble goal. The noble goal puts others in front of his own goal, altruistic. Despite the sacrifice, the odds of the main character winning are still low. This is the absolute last time new information or awareness can be added to a story. In order to avoid melodrama, underplay the exact moment the main character makes the heroic decision, or just imply it in the climax and resolution. Now that the main character has said goodbye to the old world, his old persona must also change to suit the new world. This is the moment when the main character makes that choice to change. The main character sees themselves and their flaw clearly for the first time. With this insight, they are able to see the problem or the conflict as a single moral question with no easy answer. He realizes no matter which option he chooses, loss of something valued is required. He can resist inner change and become the flaw's victim forever, or give up the old world and grow and become the victor in this new world. For the first time, the main character sees a realistic solution to the problem. He weighs the pros and cons of various new coping methods and finally chooses the best of two bad options, or the best of two irreconcilable goods. The moral idea or premise of the story and the counter idea collide head-on in a last impasse, making the direct conflict in the climax unavoidable. The tension in the story rises to the breaking point, and this might be the high point of a short story. We have seen that the main character is forced to make a choice, and that choice now reflects symbolically and thematically who the protagonist is becoming. The story's main value is at the forefront of that choice, and this choice represents a statement of what it is to be a human being. The final choice becomes to obtain the objective the main character has been pursuing throughout the story, but at a terrible moral cost, or give up the objective to maintain the moral high ground. Self-sacrifice only has meaning on a greater community or human scale, and this is where the novel picks up a global meaning to the reader. The why should I care question finally gets answered. As a writer, you want to freeze this moment in time. The crisis scene must be a static moment to contrast it with the intense action of the climax. The dominant value of the crisis must be opposite of the value won at the end of the beginning act and the story climax. So if your story ends on an up note, then this scene must be down. If your story ends down, then this may be a false celebratory scene. In Star Wars, the Millennium Falcon arrives at the Rebel base. Technical readouts of the Death Star are analyzed. As hoped, the Death Star has one weakness. The rebels must attack in one-man fighter ships down a long trench while fired upon by Darth Vader's forces, and discharge a proton torpedo at a 2-meter wide thermal exhaust port. A precise hit will cause a chain reaction that destroys the Death Star. At this briefing, someone in the background exclaims, "Well, that's impossible, even for a computer." But Luke responds, "It's not impossible. I used to bullseye womp rats in my T-16 back home. They're not much bigger than 2 meters. Luke's line foreshadows how his farm boy past will converge with his growth under Obi-Wan's tutelage to make him a Jedi Knight. Next, Luke finds Han Solo loading his reward and asks if he'll join the cause. Han refuses, calling the whole enterprise a suicide mission. In both these scenes, Luke is making a conscious, heroic decision to self-sacrifice for the rebels in contrast to the other fighters' lack of confidence and Han Solo's selfishness. Finally, we are at the climax. Now that our evolved main character has tackled his problem anew and made a heroic decision, it is time to act on that decision, even to the point of martyrdom. The reader knows that decisions don't count, actions do. Think of your last New Year's resolution. Did it count? This pivotal scene resolves the main story conflict and proves the moral premise. This one scene is what a reader endures all the worry and tension you have placed in the whole novel. Since dramatic climaxes rarely occur in real life, readers are craving a satisfying conclusion to the story events. It is the point of greatest tension, the critical moment where the protagonist can win or lose all, and it must change everything. Common examples of a climax scene are a battle, a one-on-one fight, a declaration of love, or solving a crime. In order for your climax to satisfy your reader, you need to follow a few rules. This scene must be the point of highest tension for a novel. It must resolve the conflict once and for all between our main character and the antagonist. The action the main character takes must be different from what he or she has done previously to determine growth. No new information or characters can be introduced, or it will feel like you have cheated and allowed the main character to be rescued by coincidence or luck. The reader knows no one is coming to rescue them from their problems, and they assume your protagonist should be subject to the same rules of fate. For that reason, main characters must be the centerpiece of action. They can't just be watching things play out. They have to be the agent of change, and they must be willing to give it all up for the cause. With a new sense of himself and having made his difficult decision, the main character barrels ahead into action. But not just any action. The action in the climax must prove the character's flaw that has controlled his behavior for the first 3/4 of the novel is no longer compelling his behavior. It must prove that his change has been deep and transformative, changing his inner world, belief system, and or worldview forever. Most of us are so afraid of failure. We would never attempt such a deep change, even if strongly motivated. We can only watch this transformation in awe. The action at the climax must also metabolize the circumstances presented to the character in the inciting incident. That bookends the novel, giving the manuscript a completed feeling and assures the reader this is indeed the end. After the dark night of the soul and entering Act 3, the tension dips for a moment, giving the reader a breather before the final push. Two universal values have been arguing throughout your story. In the third act, the value moves to its most negative, and the wrong idea appears to have won the argument. The jeopardy the universally good value faces ramps up the tension to its highest point. Then, at the climax, the main character reconnects with his destiny, and the positive version of the value and the story premise win after all. The sudden change in value and the premise stand out against the stark background of the rest of Act 3, creating a strong emotion. The emotion promised in the inciting incident is finally delivered to the reader. If a thriller, the emotion is nail-biting tension. If a mystery, a sense of justice is delivered. If romance is your genre, eternal love graces the last pages. Whatever emotion was hinted at in the opening scenes of your book, now is the time to deliver, so the tension the reader has felt throughout the book is satisfactorily released. The reader translates that emotion into meaning, and this makes the story powerful and memorable. At the same time the promised emotion is delivered, the story question set up by the inciting incident is also answered. However, the story question cannot be answered in a predictable way. That would also disappoint the reader. As William Goldman says, the key to all story endings is to give the audience what it wants, but not the way it expects. In order to make the reader feel the story has ended just right, the reader must be surprised by the ending, but in retrospect feel that the story could not have turned out any other way. See Episode 6 for more help on crafting this effect. In our sample movie, the Death Star creeps around a planet into position to decimate the moon that hosts the rebel base. Vader personally leads the attack on the rebels racing down the trench, aiming for the exhaust port. Of course, we all know this makes one-on-one conflict between Luke and Vader inevitable. One of the rebels gets off a shot, but it only grazes the shaft and does not go in. Vader immediately shoots the rebel down, establishing the life or death consequences in this scene. With 1 minute to go until the Death Star can fire, Luke and his 2 wingmen are the only ones left. Luke goes in full throttle. One of the wingmen asks Luke if he will be able to pull out in time at that speed, and his response is, "It'll be just like Beggar's Canyon back home." Luke's past has converged with his present, and we see the man that he is becoming. During the attack run, both wingmen and R2-D2 are hit, leaving Luke alone with Vader, locked on his tail. Luke turns on his targeting computer. Then he hears Ben's voice in his ear. "Use the Force, Luke. Trust me." The Force is Luke's secret weapon. Luke makes the leap of faith and turns off his targeting computer, backing up his decision to become a Jedi Knight with action. The Death Star powers up its planet-destroying weapon. Vader zeroes in on Luke and gloats, "I have you now!" And at this very moment, the Millennium Falcon comes diving out of the sun on top of Vader, disrupting his attack. Vader's ship loses control and spins out of sight. This may seem like Due Machina, but George Lucas set this moment up to be a secret weapon Luke didn't know he had. Luke had earned Han Solo's friendship and loyalty, and therefore Luke has been the cause of this last moment rescue. Luke has been the catalyst of Han Solo's transformation as well. Luke stretches out his feelings and fires his proton torpedoes. It's a direct hit. A second before the Death Star is about to unleash its destructive power on the rebels, it explodes. Good has triumphed over evil. Ben speaks to Luke one more time. "Remember, the Force will be with you, always." Luke has taken an irrevocable step to becoming a Jedi Knight. Spirituality has defeated evil, and the story premise is proven. The most important thing to remember about a resolution or denouement is to make it short. The main character receives a reward for successfully negotiating some sort of change. Or, if the main character has failed to change, he receives an appropriate punishment. By the climax, all story questions should be answered and all subplots concluded. Only if you must should you clean up loose ends here. The real purpose of the resolution is to illustrate how the change affects the character's future. Show how fortunes will have been changed, how the main character thinks and acts differently, and how he perceives the world more broadly. In short, his inner and outer world will never be the same by the end of the story. The other purpose of the resolution is to sell your next book or next movie. You want to leave an image in the reader's mind that gives a lasting emotional impression that, when remembered, calls forth your entire book. As I mentioned, loose ends can be tied up here if necessary, but really try to resolve everything before this final scene so as not to dilute the effect of this scene. Not all subplots need to be resolved, only those that give thematic meaning. Reward or punish the protagonist depending on how they have performed. Occasionally, particularly in noir pieces, the protagonist fails to evolve when the situation calls for it, and now fails to solve the problem as well. He is then punished in the resolution instead of rewarded. Foreshadow the protagonist's future. Imply the couple lives happily ever after. The detective is promoted for solving this difficult case. The adventurer gets the treasure and the girl, or the boy. In the character-driven story, you want to show how the main character has been transformed, how he thinks and acts differently, how his perception of the world has grown and evolved. He has recovered from the shock of the inciting incident and stabilized at a new but very different equilibrium. At the start of the climax, the story is at its darkest point, appearing to show the negative value prevailing over the positive value. By the end of the climax, there is an abrupt shift back to the positive value. In a heavily thematic story, you can show that positive effect spreading throughout the character's society, again answering the "why should I care" question. If this is a screenplay, the resolution serves the purpose to relax jangled nerves from a high-action, tension climax before the credits run. It gives the film-goer a chance to take a deep breath, wipe their eyes, and gather their car keys. Whether film or novel, the final image should make the reader cry, or laugh, or deeply think, or all three. It should concentrate all the emotion and meaning of your story into one final image that represents the story premise. That final resonant image creates a lasting emotional impression on your reader. When the reader recalls this image, it brings back all the pleasure of reading your novel in a single jolt. Added bonus is that it makes them more likely to buy your next book. The opening images of Star Wars showed the Rebel Alliance in dire peril, so the final image is its perfect bookend. Luke returns to the Rebel base, safe and secure, and is reunited with his friends. The Rebel army gathers at an award ceremony to honor Luke and Han. Luke's life is infinitely changed from the farm boy he was on Tatooine. He is now a rebel, fighter pilot, and Jedi Knight. The last image resonates with the good values of friendship, loyalty, bravery, and spirituality triumphing over the Empire's tyranny. You probably guessed what's coming next. This episode's exercise is conceptually easy but difficult to do. I'm going to ask you to summarize the action at each of the major plot points for your novel. That will give you a clear map of where your story is going. You want an outline to provide a clear roadmap, but you don't want it to be stifling. So these 9 points can easily be revised as you move through your story, making this both flexible and structured. You might want to review the plot points by listening to episode 7A and 7B again before you begin. Your book doesn't have one plot, though. You probably have some subplots in mind that support the main plot. Intricate subplotting at the outline phase is one of the ways J.K. Rowling created such a rich world with characters that seem so complex and real in her Hogwarts series. Now might be a good time to think about your subplots. Most subplots evolve around the relationships we have. How the protagonist relates to the support characters, the antagonist, and so on in your novel. So I'm not just going to ask what happens to your protagonist, I'm also asking you to pick the top 3 to 5 characters in your story and the antagonist, and write the story from each of their points of view at each of the plot points. This concludes the Story Developer series by Content Cathedral. Thank you for watching, and it's been a pleasure reaching out to you. I wish you good luck with your writing, and I hope you will let us know if this series helped you on your endeavor. Please feel free to ask questions in the comment sections. I will try to answer any questions posed. If you are a writer and you want to join Content Cathedral, drop me a line at my email, authorcalexsmith@gmail.com. You'll get access to the website monthly hangouts with other writers and announcements when we have more video lessons. Thank you once again for taking part in these lessons.